Hello, I'm Pastor Paul. Welcome to the Lord of Life Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. We're glad you're here. We know that you can't always be in worship with us, so we're glad to provide the sermons from our weekly services. We hope that you will find hope and inspiration as we have in Jesus Christ. And now, here's this week's message. The Holy Gospel according to Luke, the 16th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' Then the manager said to himself, 'What will I do, now that my master is taking the position away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly, for the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are their children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much, and whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
You may be seated. So your memory line for today is, by God's grace, we are blessed to be a blessing. By God's grace, we are blessed to be a blessing. We don't have to go far to find a modern-day parable that matches up a little bit with the one from our reading today, do we? This is the week where the first of the college admission scandal's parents were sentenced. If you didn't hear this story, there were some powerful and wealthy parents who were bribing colleges to let their child come in or give them scholarships. Honestly, I have to say I'm not too surprised to learn that people with resources would pay a college coach or university to get their children into the right school or the right athletic program. They even went as far in one case as to Photoshop the face of their child onto the face of someone else who was rowing crew, so that they could be shown to be an excellent athlete. Shrewd. That's the word Jesus uses to describe this dishonest manager. This reading is one of the more debated because of the way that it's written. And there are different views of where the original words of Jesus stop and the words of the writer are added into the mix still. And there are many different ways to interpret the text. We can understand a few things without much controversy, not least of which is this: apart from God's generosity, we have nothing. Apart from God's generosity, we have nothing, but by God's grace, we are blessed to be a blessing for others. This week I've done more reading and text studying and talking with colleagues about this text than any other in recent memory. And here's what I've learned that might be helpful for us to consider as we think about how God is speaking to us today. This parable is not about God as the rich man. In fact, both of the key characters are not very nice people. This is not the only time Jesus uses a parable that starts with, "There was a rich man." In fact, he follows up today's reading with another in verse 19, just after this reading, to address the Pharisees whom we are told were lovers of money. So we have a parable about a rich man, and he has a manager. And this manager is clever. He's smart and probably friendly enough. He knows he's been cheating his boss and is taken to task for it. His boss even fires him. That's kind of what was going on. The next lines tell us something about the character of this manager, right? Not strong enough to dig, too proud to beg. So what can he do? His fears and limitations and pride have him up against the wall. Before his boss knows it, the manager has gone to his debtors and made deals with them. In other words, he used the fact that those who owed the rich man money didn't know he'd been fired to build a nest egg for himself. The shrewd manager dispenses a form of grace in the form of forgiveness of part of a debt. Still, he acts, and it brings relief to those in debt. A kind of grace indeed. What can the rich man do? By the time he finds out about it, it's too late. Those who were indebted to him more are now giving him praise for being such a great guy. How generous you are. How nice you are. If he cracks down on them and asks for the full amount back, he looks terrible. And remember how important honor and shame are in this culture. So he has to hand it to his former manager for being smart enough to give himself a golden parachute. Now, things like that don't happen today, right? There aren't wealthy executives who get fired from a position or are forced to leave who have a nice golden parachute to land softly, right? Let's take a moment to look back at the first reading for today. I think it'll help us understand something about what Jesus is teaching. The prophet Amos makes it clear that caring for the poor and those in need is what God desires. So much so that the prophet warns the people who wish to take advantage of the poor and those in need that God will, quote, never forget, unquote, what they've done. It's about as stern a warning as you can find in the Hebrew Bible. What if Jesus wants us, his audience, to understand something important about caring for others? What if what Jesus is doing is telling a strange parable about two pretty awful people to point out that to the Pharisees and to his disciples that they're a little bit too caught up in taking care of themselves? They deal with the world shrewdly, wisely, but they're missing something important. They're missing the things that God is calling them to do in response to God's grace for them. The verse following this reading even says, the Pharisees who were lovers of money heard all this and they ridiculed Jesus. What if what Jesus truly wants, in light of what God has done for his followers, is for them to understand the freedom they have in a new way? To live using all that they have for the sake of love. Even our psalm today is a song of praise for God who, quote, raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy, close quote. Martin Luther once preached a sermon on this text, and he said, we must understand this text, give money in order to make friends, to be do good so that your faith may be known. We are the audience to whom God speaks. We are the audience who needs to hear the prophet's words for us, to care for the poor and those in need. The life of discipleship demands something of us, and we need to be reminded sometimes. This fall, we're talking about what it looks like to be a blessing to another. Each of us has been blessed in some way in our lives. We'll hear stories from our fellow members here at Lord of Life about how they've been blessed by God. We'll also hear stories of how they have been a blessing to others in response. Isn't this what Jesus is teaching us today? A shrewd manager uses what he has and his wits to serve himself, and by accident delivers grace of a kind and relief to those who are in debt. We are called to use what we have, to use all that we are to carry God's grace to others. Real grace. Through the love of God, real grace that offers hope and a promise of new life Real grace that looks like a cross and a tomb and a stone and resurrection. By God's grace, we are blessed to be a blessing. Thanks be to God.
Thanks for listening to the Lord of Life Lutheran Church Sermon Podcast. If you're ever in the Dubuque-Land area, please join us for worship. Visit our website at www.lordoflife.online to learn more about service times and about our vision for serving God and our community. God bless you.